Hello everyone, I'm Ashley at the Silverwood Public Library, and I am back once again with a read aloud for you guys. We will be reading our book, A Single Shard by Linda Sue Park, as you may well know. We are on chapter 8 for today, so if you haven't heard me read chapters 1 through 7, or haven't read them yourself, make sure and go back and check out those videos first. Yeah, there's not much else to say. I hope you guys enjoy, so let's dive right back in. Min began work on another set of inlaid vases, but before the throwing was complete, the emissary's ship docked. Emissary Kim sent a messenger to ask if any of the potters had anything new to show. Min waved the messenger away without a word. The next morning, the news blew through the village like a sudden sea breeze. The emissary had visited Kang's house. Kang had been chosen for a commission. Later that morning, Treeer swept up the remains of the destroyed vases in Min's yard. It was as he had guessed. All of the pieces bore traces of brown clouded glaze. Treeer felt numb with disappointment. He wondered how much worse it must be for Min. The potter had still not come out of the house with instructions for the day, so Treeer turned to the vegetable patch. He squatted down and began to pull the first of 1,000 noxious shoots that threatened the cucumber plants so precious to Min's wife. Someone called out from the front of the house. Treeer recognized the voice of the government official Yi. "Potter Min, the emissary is here. He wishes to speak with you." Treeer dropped the ragged weed he was holding and stole around to the window at the side of the house. He could see little, but heard everything. Min welcomed Yi, Emissary Kim, and the men of the royal cortege into his home. They sat around a low table in silence. Treeer heard the clink of pottery as Min's wife served tea. Then Emissary Kim began to speak. "This inlay work of your colleagues, it is something new and will be of great interest to the court." There was a pause. Treeer imagined Min nodding in polite agreement. "I will speak with no veil over my thoughts, Potter Min. Other aspects of Potter Kang's work are, how can I say it, not as much to my taste. Kang has been given what I will call a limited commission. He will produce a work for the court for a year to see if it pleases His Majesty." Kim hesitated, then continued. "I would far rather have given you the honor of a royal commission, but I would be remiss in my responsibilities if I were to ignore this new technique. It must be presented to the court. I will now return to Songdo, but if you were to produce something using this inlay style and bring it to me in Songdo, I would guarantee a careful consideration of the work." Treeer could barely contain his excitement. "The shards," he wanted to shout. "Show him the pieces from the rubbish heap. He is an expert. He will understand about the firing." But Min was speaking now. "The royal emissary honors me with his words, and I wish to disappoint no one, but I am an old man now. I could not possibly make the journey to Songdo. I thank the emissary for his consideration and beg his understanding for my failure." Treeer heard the swish of fine, heavy fabric as the emissary rose to his feet and went to the door. The emissary spoke once more. "It is my wish that you find a way somehow, Potter Min. It would be a great sorrow to me if this were the last time I saw your fine work." Then he and his entourage were gone. Treeer turned and slid down the wall, slumped over with his head in his hands. "The old fool," he thought. "He does not wish the emissary to see the imperfect glaze. His pride keeps him from a royal commission. The fool!" Just then Min's wife came around the house with a basket of laundry. Treeer jumped to his feet to help her. She nodded her thanks, calm as ever, as if the tumultuous events of the past few days had never happened. They stood on either side of the clothesline. He handed her the garments and she hung them. Her serenity and the rhythm of the task helped soothe Treeer's raw nerves. Yet again, he wishes he could think of a way to show his gratitude for her kindness. What was it she wanted, he wondered. She seemed to have no desires of her own, or perhaps her wishes were those of her husband's. Suddenly an answer came to Treeer as if calling from the clear sky. Doing Min a favor, a great favor, that was the way to thank her. Her husband's success. That was what she desired. Before he could think about it any longer, he heard himself speaking. "I have a request to make of the honorable potter's wife," he said. "Please," she replied. "I am aware of the generous offer made by the royal emissary," he confessed, and glanced quickly at her. Her eyes crinkled in amusement, so he knew she did not mind that he had eavesdropped. "If the master would make a vessel he considers worthy of the court's attention, it would be my greatest honor to be allowed to take it to Songdo for him." Her face was partially hidden behind the linen sheet she was hanging. She fixed it firmly to the line before she answered. "I will ask the master under one condition," she said. "No, two conditions. The first is that you return to Chopo quickly and safely." Treeer bowed, puzzled. Why should it matter to her how he journeyed? "And the second," she paused. "The second is that from now on, you will call me Ajima." Tree Ear's eyes filled with tears. He bent to pick up another piece of laundry. Ajima meant something like auntie. It was a term of great affection, reserved only for older kinswomen. Tree Ear was kin to no one, and yet Min's wife wished for him to call her Ajima. He did not even know if he could say the word. Well, Tree Ear, the gentle teasing had returned to her voice. Do you agree to my conditions? Tree Ear nodded. He spoke from behind the clothes that flapped on the line. I agree, he said, then faltered. His voice fell to a whisper. I agree, Ajima. A few days later, Tree Ear crouched under the bridge, watching idly as Crane Man shoved another sliver of wood from the chopstick he was whittling. Without looking up, Crane Man said, It is too bad that your thoughts are not on a string. If they were, I would have given them a good yank by now, to see what I could see. Tree Ear chewed on the inside of his cheek. He should have known it was a folly to keep a secret from Crane Man, even for a few days. I'll be going on a journey soon, Tree Ear said. He meant to speak firmly, but his voice sounded loud and coarse instead. A journey, eh? Crane Man continued whittling. It is a good thing for a man to see the world if he can. Where will you go? 2 days before, Min had handed Tree Ear some tools to be cleaned, saying, The vessels will be finished by midsummer. If you leave then, you will be able to return before the snow. In this way, Tree Ear learned that Min was sending him to Songdo. Since that moment, Tree Ear had regretted the rashness of his offer. He had never once left Chuopo since his arrival as a toddler. How could he possibly think of making such a journey? It would take many days over unfamiliar mountains where there might not even be a path to follow, much less a road. He might well lose his way, and who knew what perils awaited him? Robbers, wild animals, rock slides. What had he been thinking? But then, what was he to do? Tell Min he had changed his mind? No, going to Songdo was hardly possible, but not going was worse. Min had some work that must be transported, for an audience at the royal court. Crane Man put down his knife, leaned back, and crossed his arms. An audience at the court? Why the riddle talk, my friend? Why do you not say I'm going to the capital, to Songdo? Tree Ear swallowed. He rose to his feet and walked the few steps to the water's edge. Picked up a flat stone and threw it, so it skipped across the water. 4 times it lit on the surface. How is it that a stone could be so like a bird? Crane Man stood, too, and skipped a stone of his own, 6 touches. Tree Ear shrugged as a little smile stretched his lips. In all of the years under the bridge, he had never once defeated Crane Man at this game. Together they watched until the ripples from the stone had melted away. I am going to Songdo, Tree Ear said at last, as if testing the words. He looked at his companion pleadingly. It seems too far away to say it. No, my friend, Crane Man said. It is only as far as the next village. A day's walk on your young legs. Tree Ear frowned, mystified, but before he could speak, Crane Man continued. Your mind knows that you are going to Songdo, but you must not tell your body. It must think one hill, one valley, one day at a time. In that way, your spirit will not grow weary before you have even begun to walk. One day, one village, that is how you will go, my friend. Tree Ear watched as Crane Man stirred up the water with his crutch a little. Then he raised the dripping crutch and pointed it at Tree Ear. Off you go now, to bring me some straw. You will need some extra sandals for such a journey, and who is it to make them, if not I? Min spent his time on a new set of vases, 1 or 2 of which would be selected to be taken to Songdo. In the meantime, the pace had slowed considerably for Tree Ear. So frenetically he had worked during the time surrounding the emissary's visit that he was ahead of schedule in all his tasks. Plenty of wood filled the shed at the kiln site. Balls of clay and bowls of slip awaited Min's need. Tree Ear found himself idle on occasion, with too much time to think. And think he did, gathering his courage until at last there was enough of it to enable him to stand before Min with a request. What is it now? Min asked. Tree Ear had lingered by the house at the end of the day, waiting for Min to look up from his wheel. Master, Tree Ear bowed. It is now more than a year that I have been that I have had the honor of working for you. A year, yes. So? Tree Ear pulled in the muscles of his stomach to stop their quaking. I was wondering if the master would be so good, if he thinks my work worthy, Min snapped. Ask your question or leave me in peace, boy. If you would one day be teaching me to make a pot. Tree Ear's words rushed out in a single breath. Min sat motionless for a long moment. Long enough for Tree Ear to wonder if perhaps his request had been unclear. At last Min stood and Tree Ear raised his head. Know this, orphaned one, Min said slowly. If ever you learn to make a pot, it will not be from me. Tree Ear could not stop himself. Why? He cried out. Why will you not teach me? Min picked up the half-formed vessel before him and slammed it back onto the wheel with such force that Tree Ear flinched. "Why?" Min repeated. "I will tell you why." The potter's voice was low but shook with the effort of control. "The potter's trade goes from father to son. I had a son once. My son, Hyung-yu. He is gone now. It is him I would have taught. You..." Tree Ear saw the potter's eyes fierce with grief and rage. Min choked out the last words. "You are not my son." And that is the end of chapter 8. That was a very intense chapter, guys. And I was only going to read one, but I think that cliffhanger may be a bit too, harsh. So we're going to go on and read chapter 9 as well. Alright. Tree Ear could hardly breathe on his walk home. Min's words rang in his ears over and over. Orphaned one, father to son, not my son. He realized now what he had never thought to notice before. All the other apprentices were indeed sons of the potters. "It's not my fault," Tree Ear wanted to shout. He wanted to run all the way back to Min and scream the words. "It's not my fault you lost your son, not my fault that I am an orphan. Why must it be father to son? If the pot is made well, does it matter whose son made it?" Crane Man hailed him cheerfully from under the bridge with the news that 2 pairs of sandals were complete. Tree Ear feigned eagerness as he tried them on, but he knew that Crane Man had read his troubled face at once. Crane Man said nothing, only waited. Tree Ear tied the sandals together carefully in pairs. As he hung them up in a safe place under the bridge, he said, "The potter's trade passes from father to son here in Chuopo. Is it thus everywhere?" "A story tells the answer to that," Crane Man replied. He hobbled over to a large rock and sat down. Tree Ear knelt beside him. Potters have not always been considered artists, you know. In the long ago days when potters made objects for use and not beauty, it was considered a poor trade indeed. None wished for their sons to have such a lowly life. Year after year, more sons left the trade until at last there were not enough potters to supply the needs of the people. So the king at the time decreed that sons of potters must become potters themselves. Tree Ear shook his head and even managed a grim smile. Imagine, sons running away from what he wished most to do. "I do not know if it is still a law," Crane Man continued, "but a well-kept tradition can be stronger than law." Tree Ear nodded. At least he knew now that it would be useless to leave Chuopo in search of another master. Crane Man stood and leaned on his crutch to stretch out his good leg. He glanced sideways at Tree Ear. "My friend, the same wind that blows one door shut often blows another open," he said. Tree Ear stood, too, and went to fetch the supper bowl. It sometimes took him a while to figure out Crane Man's riddles, but he preferred puzzling over them to being told what they meant. Work no longer felt the same to Tree Ear. He now realized that he had been working all along toward the goal of being allowed to make a pot. With that hope gone, so went his eagerness to work. More than ever he wished that he had not been so rash as to offer to take Min's vessel to Songdo. He would do it, not for the old potter, he thought bitterly, but for Ajima. Tree Ear checked the clay at the draining site. Some of the clay balls were drying out too quickly. He dampened the cloth that covered them. Then, using a wooden blade, he scored the surface of the clay in the drainage bed, so it would dry faster. How much slower the work went when the joy of it was gone. The clay in the bed was coming along well. It would be ready to form into balls soon. Tree Ear took a handful of clay from the corner of the bed and kneaded it. Absent-mindedly, he began to form a petal shape. After so many attempts at making the petal that was eventually used for the water pot, his hands seemed to work on their own accord, flattening here, pinching there. Tree Ear's hands paused in mid-motion. Slowly, he brought the half-formed petal up to eye level and examined it closely. Molding, he thought. There was more than one way to make a piece of pottery. Throwing, of course, using the wheel to assist in shaping a symmetrical piece. But the little animals atop the incense burners, the handles of some vessels, the water droppers, they were not thrown. They were molded by hand without any aid from the wheel. For the first time in days, Tree Ear grinned as he crushed the petal back into a fistful of clay. The second door had just blown open. As usual, Min's work took far longer than he had predicted, and summer was merging with fall before the pieces were ready. A dozen replicas had been fired in 3 separate batches, and the last firing yielded a pair of superb vases. Their delicate floral inlay work shone against the perfect glazed background. Under Min's instruction, Tree Ear built a special jjigae to wear on his back. As they worked, Min grumbled about the problem of transporting the vases, speaking more to himself than to Tree Ear. Ajima came out to the yard with tea. She served them, while Min continued his muttering. "A straw container," Ajima suggested, "such as those used to carry rice, only perhaps double thickness, lined with more straw and silk. The vases would be well protected." Min sipped his tea, then turned to Trier. Do you know of one who could make such a container? So it was that Crane Man, too, came to work for Min. He and Min agreed on a price for the labor, and the Crane Man began to weave the container under the eaves of Min's house. Trier would be leaving in a few days. The straw container had been completed, sturdy with double walls and an attached lid. It was exactly the size to take the vases and padding tightly packed. Crane Man fussed about his creation, making invisible adjustments to the straw. Najima came out to see it. She and Trier exchanged amused glances behind Crane Man's back. Is it finished? Ajima asked. Crane Man stopped his poking and pinched and bowed to Ajima. It was an honor to be a part of this endeavor. Crane Man stood aside while Ajima lifted the lid of the container and closed it again, fastening it with a straw bauble and braided loop. Fine work, she said, nodding in quiet admiration. Then she turned to Crane Man, her brow furrowed. Crane Man, she said, I have a favor to ask of you. Crane Man stood up proudly on his one leg. Nothing that the honorable potter's wife could ask would be too much, he answered. Ajima bowed in return. She glanced at Trier and gestured at him with one hand. This one. I have grown accustomed to his assistance, she said. 100 little chores he does for me each day. It is a great help to me in my old age. Now it was Trier's turn to bow, which he did in bafflement. What was in Ajima's mind? I would be most grateful, Crane Man, if you could come to the house and continue this work while Trier is away, she said. Then she hung her head a little and wrung her hands as if ashamed. I could not pay you. I hope that perhaps my thanks in the form of a meal. Trier felt an enormous wave of relief wash over him, but caught himself in time to show no emotion. It would not do to embarrass Crane Man. It had been his greatest worry, how Crane Man would eat while he was away. Of course, his friend could always go back to rifling rubbish heaps and foraging in the woods, but Trier had felt it would be like abandoning him for Crane Man to go back to such scavenging. For days now he had been worrying over the problem, and Ajima had offered the answer unasked. Your offer of food is kindness itself, Crane Man said. Trier looked up in alarm. This was the phrase of polite refusal. What was Crane Man doing? I would be happy to come by from time to time, he continued. Ajima nodded soberly. Crane Man bent over and picked up the crutch, then bowed in farewell to her. I will see you back at the bridge, Trier, he said, and hopped away. Trier watched until Crane Man disappeared beyond the bend in the road, then turned to Ajima, a question in his eyes. Because he is proud, Trier, she said. He does not wish to be fed out of pity. Trier kicked a small stone at his feet. Why was it that pride and foolishness were often so close companions? Arms crossed and stance defiant, Trier stood under the bridge and began to speak. I have a journey to make, he said sternly, over a road unknown to me. 1,000 things could go wrong. Do you not think I have enough to worry about? Crane Man looked up in surprise. Trier had never before spoken to him in such anger. Are you thinking of me, my friend? Do not worry. I fed myself and you, for that matter, for many years before you worked for Min. I can do so again. Do you think me so helpless now? Not you, Trier shouted, flapping his arms in frustration like a giant bird. I am not talking of you. It is Min's wife I am thinking of. She is an old woman now. Would you have her poor back ache from pulling weeds? And those long walks in the mountains, for mushrooms or berries? She should long ago have earned rest from such tasks. From her husband she gets no help at all. He thinks of nothing but his work. Trier paused, his breath coming in gasps. He inhaled once, deeply, then spoke more quietly. Would you have me worry about her on my journey, friend? Why will you not help her? For in helping her, you would be helping me. The shock ebbed from Crane Man's eyes now that Trier was no longer shouting. He turned to face the river, then his back to Trier. Trier watched and waited. Crane Man's bad leg was shaking a little. In a moment it shook harder. Now Crane Man's whole body was trembling. Trier stepped forward in concern. He had not meant to make his friend cry. Trier touched Crane Man on the shoulder. Crane Man waved one arm at him, still shaking, but he was not crying. He was laughing. The silent laughter he had been suppressing burst out of him, and he laughed so hard that he dropped his crutch. Trier picked it up and stood in silence, first puzzled, then annoyed when Crane Man's laughter showed no sign of stopping. If there was a joke, he had missed it. Aye, my friend, Crane Man said at last, and drew in a long breath. A few last chuckles escaped him as he took the crutch from Trier and leaned on it to sit on the ground. He looked up and jabbed the crutch at Trier. A fine performance, he exclaimed. I have never seen better. Trier's mouth dropped open for an instant, but he recovered quickly. What do you mean performance? He demanded. You would question my sincerity? No, little monkey, that I would never doubt, he smiled, obviously still amused. If it means so much to you, I will go daily to the house of Min. There, does that satisfy you? Tree Ear nodded grudgingly. The matter was settled, for he knew that Crane Man would keep his word. Tree Ear's speech had gained the desired result, although not exactly in the way that he had planned. 2 vases, not the ones chosen, were packed in the straw container as a test. They had been stuffed with silk and wrapped in more silk. Rice straw was layered between them and crammed into every pocket of space. Min, Ajima, and Crane Man all watched as Tree Ear picked up the container and hurled it with all his strength to the ground. Then he rolled it over and over and even kicked it a few times. Min rushed forward and unhooked the straw bauble. He groped inside, then nodded at once in satisfaction. The vases were unbroken. Unpack it, he ordered. Tree Ear then went inside to fetch the 2 selected vessels. As soon as Min had left the yard, Crane Man stepped forward to examine the container. He, too, was satisfied. The woven straw had sustained no damage. Repacked with its precious cargo, the container was lashed to the jigay. A sleeping mat was rolled tightly and tied to the bottom of the frame. On one side hung 2 pairs of sandals, on the other a small gourd water dipper, and a bag to be filled with rice cakes. The jigay was ready. Tree Ear would leave in the morning. Tree Ear and Crane Man skipped stones under the bridge in the twilight. Before the light was gone, Tree Ear reached into his waist pouch and slowly withdrew a small object. He handed it to Crane Man. A gift, Tree Ear said, to remind you of your promise to go daily to the house of Min. He did not want to say, to remind you of me. Over the past month or so, Tree Ear had filled his idle time by molding clay. He kept a small ball in his waist pouch and experimented with it whenever he had the chance. After some time, a shape began to form out of the clay. It was almost as if the clay was speaking to him, telling him what it wished to become. A monkey, similar to a water dropper Min had once made, smaller than the palm of Tree Ear's hand. The monkey sat with his hands clasped before its round belly, looking content and well-fed. Tree Ear had inlaid 2 tiny spots for eyes and inscribed other details on his face, hands, and fur. During the preparation for the final firing of the kiln, he had secreted the little monkey in a corner and managed to retrieve it afterward without Min's notice. To Tree Ear's delight, it shared with the other vessels of that firing the fine gray-green glaze. Tree Ear had concluded the molding was not at all the same as throwing a pot on the wheel. Molding lacked the same sense of wonder, and of course no perfect symmetrical vessel could be made without the wheel. There were still times when the vision of the prunus vase he had once dreamed of making appeared in his mind's eye, as if mocking him. In spite of this, Tree Ear found that he enjoyed the incision work. He had spent hours on the details of the monkey's features, inscribing them with progressively finer points. This, at least, was the same process, whether on a molded figure or a thrown pot. On seeing the monkey after it had been fired, Tree Ear felt a quiet thrill. The monkey was hollow, like all the water droppers Min made. But as Crane Man had no need for such of a thing, Tree Ear had not added the water holes. It was simply a little figure, almost like a toy. Crane Man examined the gift closely. He turned it over and around and stroked its smooth finish. He started to speak, but the sound of his voice was rusty, and he shook his head instead. He hobbled over to the basket where he kept his odds and ends, and brought forth a piece of twine. Still silent, he fixed the twine cleverly around the monkey, tied a firm knot, and slipped the loop around his belt. The monkey swung gaily at his waist. At last he spoke. "I am honored to wear it," he said, and bowed. "The honor is mine," Tree Ear responded. Crane Man looked down and played with the monkey in his fingers. "I have no gift for you, beyond words," he said. "I would tell you this. Of all the problems you may meet on your journey, it will be people who are the greatest danger. But it will also be people to whom you must turn if ever you are in need of aid. Remember this, my friend, and you will travel well." And that was the end of chapter 9. Well, we are done for today. I hope you guys are excited to find out next time how the journey goes, or at least the beginning of it. There's only a few more chapters left in the book, I think maybe 4 or so. So, check in back on Friday, and then Mondays, Wednesdays, Fridays, as we finish this book, and choose one more, I believe, for the summer. So, thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed. Have a wonderful day, and bye-bye.